Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. So let us step back and see what we're doing here. In this module, we are looking at a lot of the different issues that we need to think about when we come to applying a hadith. So, for example, in the last lecture, we talked about the issue of weak hadith and why it is sometimes used and where it should not be used and so forth. Now, after what we've covered so far, hopefully we can all agree that when it comes to halal and haram and rules and regulations and things that will significantly impact people's lives, we need to use strong hadiths. And of course, in our first module, we covered how our scholars went about deciding how hadiths were strong. Now, that methodology focused almost exclusively on assessing the strength of the chain of the transmission, or isnad, to tell us if the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually said what was being reported. And sometimes the scholars would compare a hadith to other narrations of the same hadith to uncover these nebulous concepts of illah or shudud, aberrancies and hidden defects. But many or possibly most hadiths have only single chains of narration. And in these cases, early hadith scholars only looked at the isnad to decide whether to accept it or to reject it. And they hardly ever rejected a hadith because its content or matn was considered unacceptable. And this is a big issue. And this lecture is probably one of the most important in the entire course. And the issue that our early classical scholars did not use the content of a hadith to judge it as unacceptable is very nicely stated by the hadith scholar Professor Jonathan Brown in his book Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. And I've put the page number here for you for this quote because it is critical. And he says one of the most obvious characteristics of early hadith criticism is that early scholars almost never discussed the contents of hadith, let alone explicitly rejected a hadith because its content was unacceptable. And the italics are in the original text. If you buy the book and open to that page, almost never is italicized for emphasis that this really hardly ever happened. Now, in contrast to this approach, we believe that matn analysis and the use of reason is a critical aspect in judging the authenticity of hadith. This issue has generated some very significant controversy because it involves applying our intellect to decide whether a hadith is sahih or not. In other words, whether or not the Prophet actually said it based on its content, even though it may have a strong isnad. So let's start off looking at why the early classical scholars who collected hadiths didn't want to use matn analysis and reason. Remember again, the matn of the hadith is its content. It's what the Prophet actually said or what is purported that he said, and the isnad is the chain of transmission. How did it get to us? Now there were two main and somewhat connected reasons why the classical hadith scholars, by and large, did not use the matn or the content to reject a hadith. The first of these was a philosophical choice, that human reason should not be placed above a report from the Prophet with a sound chain of transmission. In other words, if a hadith seems outlandish or bizarre, then it's simply a test of faith, and we shouldn't put our own fallible reason above the text of the hadith, because then we're using our whims to decide what to believe and what to reject. Now, this was stated by the scholar named Ibn Qutayba, who died in 889 of the Gregorian calendar, as follows. He said, "And we do not reject what has been transmitted authentically from him," here meaning the Prophet, "because it does not accord with our conjectures or seem correct to reason. We hope that in this lies the path to salvation and escape from the baseless whims of heresy." So that really was the stand of the group of people named Ahl al Hadeeth, the people of Hadith. And we've already quoted the opinion of Imam Ibn Hanbal that you hardly see anyone applying reason or ra'i to some issue of religion or law, except that there lies in his heart some deep-seated resentment. An unreliable narration from the Prophet is thus dearer to me than the use of reason. End quote. So the classical scholars who took this approach, again, are known as Ahl al Hadeeth, the people of Hadith. And the second reason that they were so adamant about the point of view that we just talked about is that Ilm al-Hadith emerged at a time of intense ideological struggle between this group, the Ahl al-Hadith, and another group called Ahl al-Ra'i, or the people of opinion. And among these were a group of Muslim rationalists known as the Mu'tazila, who were considered heretical by many of the Ahl al-Hadith. The Ahl al-Hadith were so attached to their point of view that hadiths with a sound chain should be believed regardless of content, that they sometimes allowed into their collections seemingly ridiculous hadiths, even when they had questionable chains. So recall, for example, the hadith we mentioned earlier, describing how when God sits on his throne, it squeaks like a saddle mounted by its rider, astaghfirullah. More importantly, recall that the reason such hadiths were sometimes collected was to train the Muslim to believe in material transmitted from the Prophet, regardless of, quote, the logic of its contents. Now, in contradistinction, the Ahl al-Ra'i, particularly the Mu'tazila, believed strongly in the use of human reason to judge the content of a hadith and to determine if it was sound. Therefore, Mu'tazilite scholars believed that a hadith had to agree with the Quran, with the absolutely established Sunnah of the Prophet, and with human reason to be considered sound. As Professor Jonathan Brown states, quote, "In order to know if any hadith was authentically from the Prophet, Mu'tazilite scholars like Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, he died in 931, believed that it had to agree with the Quran and reason. For the Mu'tazilites, the idea that one could examine the isnad of the hadith to know if it was reliable or not was preposterous." This is from Professor Jonathan Brown's book Hadith, page 97. Now, why am I quoting you the source and the page numbers here? Because this area is really very controversial. A lot of traditionalists find statements like that heretical, that examining just the isnad would be preposterous without also examining the content. A lot of traditionalists feel exactly as we talked about Ahl al Hadeeth, that if the chain of transmission is sound, you have to accept the hadith. As you can probably tell by now, we do not feel that way. So, for example, a Mu'tazilite scholar named Abu Ali al-Jubai was once asked to evaluate two hadiths with the same isnad, and he accepted one and he rejected the other. When he was asked about how he could do that, he said of the hadith he had rejected that it could not have been said by the Prophet, quote, "because the Quran demonstrates its falsity, as does the consensus of the Muslims and the evidence of reason." So once again, this attitude is really completely antithetical to the approach of Ahl al Hadeeth, who felt that introducing human reason into the judgment process was to make the rules of Islam subject to human whim. Now it turns out that Ahl al Hadeeth, the classical Sunni approach that they took, fairly quickly became dominant during the early classical period. Because the Ahl al Hadeeth, who won the ideological battle against Ahl al Ra'y, were collecting hadiths and establishing hadith sciences at the time of this ideological struggle, the hadiths which have come to us in the main or canonical collections did not use the approach of Ahl al Ra'y and did not use the hadith content to reject hadiths except in extreme circumstances. For example, al-Bukhari rejected a hadith, quote, "The Prophet forbade the breaking apart of Muslim coins in circulation." He did this because the hadith was clearly counterfactual, since he noted, al-Bukhari that is, that Muslims did not use coins during the life of the Prophet. But seemingly things had to be this egregiously false before a hadith would be rejected on the basis of content in the early classical era. Now, as we've said already, we make no secret that we are more in favor of the approach of Ahl al Ra'y, and God knows best. We note that among Ahl al Ra'y were many of the Hanafi scholars, and this is one of the main madhabs or schools of thought in Islam, and that many of the Hanafi scholars were quite sympathetic to the Mu'tazilite way of thinking. And we will give some examples of this way of thinking and some of the criteria which the Hanafi scholars used in deciding the validity of hadiths in just a little bit. But before doing this, we need to stress a point that's often neglected by those who only quote the canonical hadith collections and the opinions of the early classical scholars, thinking that by doing that they've maintained the purity of Islam. So what is this point, you ask? Well, it's critical to note that beginning in the 1200s or so, after the classical Sunni approach had won the ideological battle over the Mu'tazilites, many Sunni scholars actually began to embrace the approach of using content to reject hadiths, in part feeling comfortable to do so now that the Mu'tazilites were no longer a threat. However, the reasons were deeper than that. If you've ever heard of Hegel's dialectic, it's a theory of history. It's usually summed up as thesis versus antithesis produces synthesis. What that means is that when two opposite philosophies collide, the product is often the synthesis of a new theory or approach which borrows from each. And this is to some extent what happened in the clash between Ahl al Hadeeth, again, those who wanted to take hadith literally, to exclude human reason from judging the matn or content of a hadith as a criteria for accepting it, and the Ahl al Ra'y, at whose extreme end were the Mu'tazilites, again, who thought that human reason should be a significant arbiter, and that hadiths should be judged by matn as well as by isnad for authenticity. The clash of philosophies produced a sort of Hegelian synthesis as expressed by Professor Brown. Quoting from Professor Brown, starting in the late 1000s, however, as the Mu'tazilite rationalist threat faded from view and classical Sunni Islam emerged triumphant, hadith critics began writing books that rejected whole prophetic traditions, often because their meanings were unacceptable. End quote. That's Jonathan Brown, Hadith, page 99. The hadiths thus rejected were called mawdu'at, or forged hadiths. One of the most famous books of mawdu'at was written by the scholar Ibn al-Jawzi, he died in 1201, who stated that any hadith that you see contradicting reason or fundamental principles of Islam, know that it is forged. Now, Professor Brown also notes, quote, "As we have seen, Mu'tazilites had no compunction about making content criticism the centerpiece of their method of hadith evaluation. The Hanafi judge, Isa ibn Abban, thus argued that the early Muslim community rejected ahad reports that contradicted the Quran or established Sunnah, or described an event that would have been more widely reported had it really occurred. He also makes the verdict of reason the ultimate arbiter for judging the veracity of a report, not the isnad. End quote. Professor Brown, Hadith, page 104. One last quote to throw at you. And finally, quote, although Sunnis considered Mu'tazilism to be a heresy, Mu'tazilite legal theory and its perspective on hadith had a major impact on Sunni legal theory, end quote. And Professor Brown also discusses how Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, a towering figure in Sunni legal theory and theology, was a former Mu'tazilite who used Mu'tazilite rationalism to defend his newly embraced Sunni ideology, and that, quote, the major architects of what is known as the Jumhur or majority school of Sunni legal theory followed in his footsteps, essentially tailoring Mu'tazilite thought to the contours of Sunni belief. So, it's very important. What are all these quotes saying? They are saying something that we seem to have forgotten about in our modern age. That yes, in the early classical age, the Ahl al Hadeeth were predominant. You did not use your reason to judge a hadith. But we see that a true Hegelian synthesis took place, and that the Sunni school of thinking came around and embraced a lot of the Mu'tazilite approach. This would be the middle classical or late classical period. And we now in our modern age, a lot of us seem to have forgotten that this occurred. We now treat using reason as some sort of bid'ah or some sort of heretical, modernist watering down of Islam, and that's not true at all. This Hegelian synthesis probably reached a peak with the work of the Hadith master al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. He died in 1071, whose work truly melded Mu'tazilite thinking with Sunni Hadith criticism. We've already noted that this led to things that would not have been imagined a couple of centuries earlier, like that the scholar Ibn al-Jawzi wrote his famous book of rejected hadiths called Kitab al-Mawdu'at, where the rejection was often based on Matn. Now we have to say, for the sake of intellectual honesty, that this hadith book remains controversial among hadith scholars, like for example al-Dhahabi, but other very famous classical scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Suyuti, and Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya also wrote similar books. Therefore, the thinking of the Mu'tazilites and the Ahl al-Ra'i eventually came to have some genuine influence over classical hadith scholarship, and it is very important for you, a student of hadith, to understand this. That is why we go through all of this history. It's to stress that in the late classical period, the use of reason had come to play a part in hadith scholarship. Now this, of course, was after the compilation of the canonical hadith collections that we already talked about. So why stress this use of reason? In part because we think that there has been a lack of recent serious scholarship regarding the issue of matn or content and its bearing on the acceptance of hadiths. Seemingly, many Muslims are afraid of charges of heresy or lack of respect for the Sunnah, or perhaps of accusations that their faith is not sufficiently strong to, quote, just believe what the Prophet has said. This is not a small issue. For example, a recent article in Arabic on islamweb.net, in commenting about a controversy surrounding a certain hadith, I won't go into what that hadith is right now, stated the following. I'm translating from their Arabic, quote, "The rationalist school has aggrandized the role of mind and exaggerated therein until they have clothed it in something beyond its size and abilities. So that you see how sacred the proponents of this school of thought have made the intellect, that they now make it an arbiter and judge over what has been explicitly revealed through inspiration, meaning to the Prophet, in other words, hadiths, and an independent measure for accepting or rejecting hadiths. One of the fruits of this barren and empty approach in dealing with revelation, again meaning hadiths, is that they have started to reject hadiths which the scholars have agreed are sahih, with the claim that these hadiths, clash with logical evidence." I'll end the quote there, but you see that this really is an issue. So in light of criticisms like these occurring still in our modern day, it's critical for modern Muslims to remember, as their late classical predecessors knew, that, quote, "the mere formal soundness of an isnad is not considered definitive proof of the actual genuineness of the text of the traditions to which they are attached. According to the traditionists, even if the isnad is completely without fault, the text should still be analyzed before the genuineness of its attribution can be established." This is from Professor Siddiqui, Hadith Literature, Its Origin, Development, and Special Features, page 33. And I am giving you the reference here, again, to underscore that this stance, which is now unfortunately controversial in the modern day, was definitely part of our late classical hadith tradition, and that we as modern day Muslims, especially in the West, need to understand that this is part of our tradition. This is not a bid'ah. It's not something being invented to loosen up the hadith, etc. And that we do need to at least study and understand where reason comes in to judging both the soundness of the hadith and the applicability of a hadith. And we'll end this lecture on that because we don't want any one lecture to go too long. And inshallah, in the next lecture, we will continue, though, with the same topic about the use of reason and Matn analysis in hadith. Assalamu alaikum.